Yeah, we sent an email. Like, I actually on Tuesday. They said like if no one comes, then
Yeah, okay.
we learn when I look at I make so execute. What?
I'm pretty sure I did everything. Wait, hold on. Please check. Oh, now I'm.
No, you're
Oh, geez, wait a minute. Because I was up pretty late yesterday. Did I turn that in? Oh, no.
I don't know, man.
Hold on, now I gotta go check. Oh.
Sorry, it's still fine. Have a point, but
Let's have a point. It's fine, but like, I finished it last night. Oh.
there is that additional step, submission.
Yes. No, it's on my desktop at home. You'll get it when I get home. Oh man, I feel silly. I guess I didn't do it. Muffin?
This is your consolation prize.
Muffin.
You like pumpkin
Oh, I love it.
yourself. You made it.
I love it.
My husband made it. Oh, because today is my birthday.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Oh, they smell so good.
I will report that. So, thank you. I thought is he the one that followed recipes? Well. I woke up this morning, he said, okay, you want to something? Oh. He said, okay, hang on. I was like, no, here's the recipe. So I said, follow the recipe. Yeah, so, and he, I mean, if you give him the recipe, he can follow it. But if I was just like, put together a little flour, no, forget it. We would not be able to. Happy birthday. Thank you. I'm actually 40 years old. Oh my God. So it's a milestone. We needed muffin.
Oh my God.
I hope you like it. So you have to put your mind in the mindset of a muffin, like not a cupcake. It's not especially sweet, right? But it's
No. It's perfect. I'm diabetic now. That's when I've had so many problems lately.
I think you're doing pretty well.
Oh yeah, I'm losing a lot of weight. I'm having this.
Are you?
Yeah.
What do you do that like is helping you like
So instead of taking the bus, I walk from my house to the train station. It's a good 20-minute walk every day. And then I do the same thing going home. I get over to the south side and I walk another 20 minutes. I've been weightlifting. I've been watching my sugar intake. And so far I lost about, the doctor said more than 10 pounds. He says it's hard to calculate because I'm also gaining muscle since I'm weightlifting.
Right, sure.
But he says I'm doing good. The biggest thing in it though, my AC1, I lowered it by 10 points.
What's AC1? That's
That's the
kind of
diabetic sugar.
cholesterol
Yeah,
that-
the
okay.
diabetic sugar thing.
Oh, the
So
diabetic
that's how
sugar.
they measure it.
Okay.
So the healthy level is 6.5.
Okay.
I was at 7.6. I lowered it by 10 in 4 months.
That's
So I made it to
super.
6.6 right now.
good for you. Do you feel better?
Oh, I think I feel better. I'm feeling very energetic.
Yeah.
It's been wonderful. It's been hard, but wonderful. I have a sweet tooth. I love the sweet tooth.
I think most Americans do, right? Like that's like a huge part of our diet. Maybe if you like.
I learned to love pumpkin without sugar. It was very depressing.
It's the same, right? Like learning how to produce it all. Yeah.
So I also have prep manager and coffee. So here we use those protein shakes, they're pre-made already, they're like a little, to go thing.
The powder ones?
The what?
The powder ones or like
The
the.
red cake. We're gonna go.
No.
Okay, so I use like the flavor and use that as my secret. So now I.
That's good. Yeah.
Oh, okay. There you go.
Like the muscle.
Yeah, but yeah, whatever it is, you drink any of those during the day. And it's my breakfast. That's it. Protein shake.
That's a good idea.
There you go.
All right, we better get started. Number 7. We're almost halfway there. I guess once we get midway. No. We have week 8 is the midpoint. So almost there. This week on our agenda, we're gonna check in with your tasks for the week, and then our focus is gonna be on affective or emotional factors in language learning. So chapter 6 in the correct textbook. So for this week, it's fairly typical from week to week. So you'll be doing a video as I recall, it's not especially long, but I think I asked for 3 original annotations due on Saturday and then 2 replies due on the following Monday. But all that information is on you. So just follow the instructions that you find there. There is quiz number 6, and then your 4th journal entry. All those things due Monday. And do make sure that you're keeping up with those. The D12 will automatically drop your lowest 2 quiz scores. And if you submit your journal entries late, that's okay, but definitely keep on them because you do lose 10% of potential points for every day that they're late, so half a point for each day that they're late. But that's still, submit it late, you'll still get some points. And I think it's important with a project like this that you just keep working on it because it builds. You're building on what you're learning each week, and you're trying different things in your language learning journey. It's important to make sure that you're keeping up. So with that, so any questions on the subject of language learning project, anything else in this class at all? Yeah, go ahead. Sophie.
So I found a website where they have like different things to learn in college. Can I use this website for like the next journal interview and do something else?
Yes, so definitely. If you're finding something that you're finding really useful and you want to keep up with it, absolutely yes. But keep adding to it as well. Because that's sort of idea of the whole project is that you try out a variety of techniques and methodologies. So kind of supplementing what you're finding working already with exploring alternative resources.
So, we know there's some method that won't work. We still try it.
It might be useful for you just to test out the hypothesis, right? So if you see something you're like, this is probably garbage, it still might be helpful to do half an hour of it or one little unit of it or something, whatever it is.
Okay. I was thinking about like going to learn, but I know it's not going to do anything for me.
Well, okay. Yeah, if it's a novel written, for an adult reader in that
I
language.
wish it was like Italian for dummies or something. But it was a book, and I don't do well with just.
In general, if that's your sort of organization. I was just saying, maybe there's some value, and you might be surprised by something in that book that you find helpful, and that would give you an opportunity to reflect on, these ways my hypothesis that this would not work for me was confirmed, and then these other ways that actually my hypothesis was challenged because I found that there might be a kernel of something useful.
Okay.
So yeah, I would suggest you could try. Other questions about that project or anything else in this class before we kind of dive into the content?
Can I give up now?
No! Why would you say that?
It's been a struggle. It's been interesting, but like I've been finding so there's 10 vowels and 16 consonants. So like by combining the symbols, it creates a different sound and everything, and someone sounds familiar, and I was like, oh man, I think it's too much. I think this wasn't good. Yeah. I'm having fun with it, but
It's true. And that's a good example of where kind of the range of phonemes in the languages you have, English and Spanish, and a handful of others, to a certain extent, don't necessarily align with what's available in this language, right? So it sounds like
I don't think a lot of them stick to it. I'm like one or two changes to it. Like right now, I can't even begin to. So I'm trying to build myself up from the vocabulary, the alphabet, to the vocabulary, but I'm struggling with the alphabet. So I haven't gotten into the vocabulary completely. So I'm using videos to see how they pronounce the music. I love music because I can hear how the pronunciations are being said.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's been interesting.
I mean, I think that that's all really useful experience then to sort of see your sort of how you're hitting a wall fairly early on of feeling frustrated and like this is not going well. It probably will continue to go well, but I don't know. I have to just keep at it. That's how a lot of language learners experience.
I do think that this language particular is going to be one of those languages that I'm not going to learn anything in 8 months. I might learn like things here and there. I will pick up things here and there. But it's one of those languages, kind of like when I did Japanese, that I have to sit down and like go through it. And I'd rather have an instructor for it because the biggest challenge for me right now is to keep focus on it.
Yeah, it is very challenging for most people to do an independent language
Yeah.
learning process without any kind of instructor or partner or something like that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and yeah, 8 weeks is a very short time frame. Our goals have to be very high, right? We don't have high expectations that you're going to develop significant vocabulary or conversational skills and kinds of things. It's really supposed to be a very productive kind of thing. But all of those things are useful for your reflecting in your journals about this process and what it's been like for you, how you can sort of anticipate these sorts of things are for you.
And so,
Any other questions or comments on the project, on this class, any of that?
Oh, thank you for the moment. That was really
Thank you. I will tell my husband that
good.
you. Yeah. And those of you who are choosing languages where there are people you could use it with.
Oh, man.
There are some Korean, exchange students here as well as probably Korean American students, Koreans to a certain extent, that you could try and tap and see if there's a little bit more of an interactive opportunity because that really does, in many cases, produce a lot more motivation when there's an actual human with which you could communicate, with whom you communicate in this language. And that leads us to a certain extent to our topic for today, which is affective factors in language learning. In this chapter of the Brown textbook, chapter 6, the two sort of primary topics that we're going to be considering are affect, our emotions, our feelings, whether positive, negative, or neutral, and how that impacts language learning, as well as motivation, intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation, and other organizations. We'll touch on those things today in your basic or next activity for the week. So the last 2 weeks we focused mainly on sort of the cognitive domain, on learning styles, learning strategies, but the affective domain in chapter 6 and 7 really bring us more emotional and personality and motivational, socio-cultural factors related to this. When you hear the word affective or the affective domain, do you have any sort of sense of what does that mean? What are we talking about?
First thing that comes to mind is affect.
Okay. That is a common like confusion of like people are often confused with I'll just say that people are commonly confused with did it affect me or did it effect me? AFFECT or EFFECT? That's actually a different definition of the word affect with an A. In English, we have a lot of polysemy. Polysemy is a word that means multiple meanings for the same word. I know it sounds like polygamy, but it's polysemy. I wish I had a marker. I would write it down for you. But the word affect, for our purposes, is really another kind of word that means something like the emotional side of human behavior, feelings about ourselves and others. Why do you think affective considerations, thinking about emotions and feelings and how they relate to human behavior, why is that important when we think about language work?
Well, sort of how I am right now, frustrated. Getting affected. The emotional side of it, so like,
It is affecting you, your affect is affecting you, right? So sometimes our feelings, whether or not we're feeling frustrated or stressed or anxious, or potentially positive emotions like feeling at ease, feeling excited, feeling engaged, those can impact language learning. Language is also typically woven into our behavior and our self-identity. So we have an understanding, a self-understanding that has a lot to do with the language that we're capable of using. And some would say that learning a second language involves developing a new kind of self-identity, a new understanding of yourself as a person who can use a second language, sometimes proficiency, sometimes not so proficiently. And that can be an important consideration when it comes to adults and adolescents, somewhat less when we think about children, primarily because children are typically less inhibited when it comes to taking risks in a second language, and also their sense of themselves, their self-identity is less down. Do you remember a couple of weeks ago we watched this video of really old Stephen Krashen, and he talked about the affective filter. Does anyone remember what that was? You know, I'm talking about
the first video we watched.
I think it probably was the first one. Anyone remember the affective filter? Okay. We are going to watch the clip of that, like the last maybe 4 minutes of that video, to remind ourselves what that is, affective filter.
I'd like to discuss one more hypothesis before we move on to literacy. And this is a very important one, called the affective filter hypothesis. Our research in language acquisition has concluded that there are several factors that relate to success in language acquisition, and I'm going to list them here on your screen. One factor is motivation. Students who are more motivated do better in language acquisition. Those of you who study this know that it's a little more complicated than this, but this is a good approximation. Second, self-esteem. That is the dominant concept today in popular psychology. Students with more self-esteem, more self-confidence do better in language acquisition. Third, anxiety. And here the correlations are negative. The lower the anxiety, the better the language acquisition. In fact, my hypothesis is for language acquisition to really succeed, anxiety should be 0. This has happened to you. Have you ever been in a situation speaking a language that you may not speak very well? When the conversation gets so interesting, you temporarily forget that you're using another language. If this is happening to you, that's when you're acquiring. When your focus is completely on the message, what the other person is saying, and your anxiety is temporarily gone. By the way, as an important footnote to this, I guess today we say sidebar. As a sidebar to all this, I'm not sure that 0 anxiety is right for everything. I'm sure it's good for a lot of things, but I'm not quite sure how far to push this. Speaking to you as a college teacher, speaking to you as a parent, I'm not all that free and easy. I think there are certain things in school children absolutely must learn. I think my students at the University of Southern California should suffer. We have hard classes, tough requirements. You don't do the work, you're out. I finally learned what they tried to teach us in educational psychology. The amount of drive or anxiety necessary to accomplish a task depends on the task. Sometimes we call facilitative anxiety is okay. I don't believe in torture, but sometimes a little anxiety is okay. Language acquisition, though, is different. For language acquisition to succeed, anxiety has to be directed somewhere else, not in the language. Frank Smith puts it this way: for the child to develop literacy, the child has to assume that he's going to be successful. The way we integrate this into the theory is like this. If a student isn't motivated, if self-esteem is low, if anxiety is high, if the student is on the defensive, if the student thinks the language class is a place where his weaknesses will be revealed, he may understand the input, but it won't penetrate. It won't reach those parts of the brain that do language acquisition. A block keeps it out. We call this block the affective filter. Here's how it works. Somewhere in the brain, Chomsky tells us, is a language acquisition device. Our job is to get input into the device. So that's input here. Low motivation, low self-esteem, high anxiety, the block goes up, the filter goes up, and the input cannot get in. This explains how it can be that we can have two children in the same class, both getting comprehensible input. One makes progress, the other doesn't. One is open to the input, the other is closed. Let me now try to summarize everything I've said in the last 10, 15 minutes or so, and I'll summarize it in one sentence, and we'll wonder why it took me that long. We acquire language in one way, and only one way, when we get comprehensible input in a low anxiety environment. Okay, there's this.
Summarize. What he meant by the affective filter. Okay.
To get more in from her instead of things, but you will not be able to, if there's something with lock you away, not be able to get any language or information.
Yeah. Would anyone add to that?
It's something kind of like focusing.
What do you mean?
You, when we tend to focus, we're always paying attention to something. We have that, but until it's a block, such a block, our attention is distracted, is focused.
Yeah, yeah. So both of you are right. And so here is sort of the affective filter, right? Up here we have that comprehensible input. Who can remind me what's comprehensible input? Comprehensible input, I plus 1. Just a little higher, right? Yeah. So language that the student can understand is and is I, and then that plus 1 is just a little bit higher. Kind of keep on pushing students, so that they're getting newer, slightly challenging, more challenging information. But it's not language that's way high above their current level. So we've got this comprehensible input. We want it to calm down into their little brain where the language acquisition device is, right? Chomsky had this idea that it's somewhere that's in our brain, there's this metaphorical black box, but it's not a real structure, but it's an ability that all humans have to organize language and understand it. And so we got the comprehensible input way up here, we got the language acquisition device in our brain down here, but here's represented as a funnel, and Chomsky represented as kind of like a block, right? Like a ball almost. And what is the block or the funnel made up of? He mentioned there was 3 things. If our anxiety is high, right? If our self-esteem is low, and if our motivation is low. He said in those 3 situations, high anxiety, low self-esteem, and low motivation, that's like a filter or a block that makes it very, very hard or impossible for all that comprehensible input to come into our brain. He says our goal, if we want our students to really effectively acquire language, is to make sure they're getting comprehensible input in a low or zero anxiety environment where their motivation is high and their self-esteem or their belief that they will succeed is high. In that situation, the funnel opens up or the block comes away, and the comprehensible input comes right in, no problem. And he mentioned sometimes a situation where you find yourself in where you are acquiring language without even realizing. Do you remember how he described it? What did he say about it?
You really into the conversation. You really forget.
Yeah, but he mentioned, you know, you're in a conversation with someone or some kind of communicative exchange where you're so engaged in what you're talking about, you're so motivated and you're so at ease, your anxiety is very, very low, that you forget you're even using a second language and you're just using it. And he says that's when acquisition is happening. Have any of you actually ever experienced something like that?
Yes.
Yeah. Give us an example.
Couple of times I've tried to demonstrate
Uh-huh.
and then just being able to read them with them and being able to answer some of the questions. It's a little bit fun, like I to the point that they compliment, oh, Japanese, you do very good pronunciation. And my Italian, it's like I mix it with Spanish, but it's okay.
How about you, Valentina? What was the situation?
Since English was my second language, when I talk to certain friends, usually talk Sicilian, but then we switch to English, then friends would get it and keep talking to it, and it was a realize that, you know, I said my English, it became part of our conversation.
Sure. And in that situation, were any of you anxious that someone in the room was going to judge how you were speaking English? Were you feeling confident in your use of English? And perhaps you would say you had no concerns that someone was looking over your shoulder, waiting for you to make a mistake. You felt confident that you were in a safe situation to use whichever language you preferred. And the issue of learning or using a second language it wasn't a thing anymore, right? He would say that's when true acquisition is happening, where our brains our consciousness around language learning isn't even aware any longer because that affective filter has come down so effectively. That's how it
Is
is.
that why immersion programs were created? So that you don't think into languages? It's the one, right?
Immersion programs, I think, were typically created more based on the idea of something like direct method. This idea that first language will just get in the way, and we want students to connect meaning directly in the second language without using L1 as an intermediary at all. And so the best way we can do that is just putting them in a situation where they're only hearing the second language, and then they'll pick it out. And, the success of programs like that really depends on how well they are designed for beginners. So if you're using a lot of comprehensible input and really starting at the level that those students are, then I think it can be very, very effective. But often what we've seen in the case of English as a second language immersion for English learners here in the United States has just been dumping ELL into mainstream classrooms with no ESL support and calling that immersion, right? Where they're just expected to be able to handle academic content at the same level of first language English users with no supports, no comprehensible input, no modified content. And just saying, well, it's immersion. It's really more of a sink or swim situation that's not designed for language learners. So, yeah, I think sometimes you hear the word immersion, but it can mean a lot of different things. If it's actually designed for language learners with comprehensible input and other scaffolding supports, it can be fantastic. Okay, so there's a long list of affective factors that may have an impact on acquiring a second language, and we're gonna talk about some of these. So self-esteem was mentioned, the idea of self-efficacy or students, sort of taking control or taking responsibility for their own learning. Issues related to inhibitions and their a student's willingness to communicate, which is related to the idea of risk-taking, also anxiety, empathy, and then introversion. Yeah. So what I'd like you to do actually is get in two groups of three and talk about these questions up here. How would you define self-esteem? What's that? How might self-esteem impact second language acquisition? Is high self-esteem obviously better? How might low self-esteem be better than high? Could there be an upper limit to the benefit of high self-esteem? And then how would you differentiate self-efficacy from self-esteem? So this last question, we may need a little more explanation, but at least for these first few questions about self-esteem and its relationship to second language acquisition, maybe the three of you in a group and the three of you talk about those for a few minutes and then we'll share out.
First time I hear that word. Sorry.
For me, it would be the opposite. It was low, maybe sometimes. Even though like we like struggling in school, that you feel like it's okay. You're learning. It just needs time for you to learn.
So here's what I'm doing. I think it's easier for someone. Someone who's close to esteem sometimes is doubting himself. That's why it's one else. But in the end, I think that self-esteem. Yeah, I think that's what I wouldn't say self-esteem. I think everyone from the research I did, efficacy means the ability to produce a desire of the intended. So just having the desire or the intended. So that sometimes we care too much about how we say things. And then it affects our self-esteem. For me, I don't get this. I jump
You have a low self-esteem. How are you gonna have a desire?
I think the desire would be not that much, like you won't be that motivated.
I wouldn't believe that. So like, even the person who goes to still,
Yeah.
they're just speaking. I would be surprised. Yes, question. Let's say I have low self-esteem, but I'm fluent in Spanish. If you ask me a question in Spanish, if I have to answer it, I will answer it. And that's why efficacy, the desire or the set to provide those effects. So it's kind of interesting, but I feel that to learn that language, the esteem does what it does. So someone prepares something might be fast. So However, you can say the same thing because someone with lower self-esteem is gonna be practicing harder.
Okay, this group on self-esteem and second definition.
Let's say that like there's like are various like your language learning self-esteem, like, you know, like, because like we define it as like how you feel about yourself, like, so I like self-esteem. And we also talk about self-esteem. Like if you do like like I guess if you have like low self-esteem, like grow, get that yourself. If you have like a high self-esteem, it's like too high. You know, we kind of work like teaching things.
Yeah. When you get started with that.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I think that those are important points. What does this perspective say about self-esteem and second language?
Oh, you want me to speak over it? You know I love my voice. So it's interesting because we don't necessarily pay attention to the effects of low self-esteem, like I was saying. Someone with high self-esteem will be like, oh, I love this. This is easy. I'm doing this. I love this language. I got this. Someone with low self-esteem could be like, oh, I understand what's going on and I can answer this right and everything. Where the person with high self-esteem is learning to less and everything, the person with low self-esteem is working harder to acquire that language. So they're both acquiring that language. The example I use is the whole if someone is shy, low self-esteem and everything, they know the language. If they have to answer the question in that language, they will answer it because they know the language.
Right. So, and it seems to me that there's a kind of general agreement that on the one hand, it's important to have a high enough self-esteem to believe that you're capable, to believe, to have confidence to try. I think Passion was saying something about literacy, that the child needs to believe that she will be successful in learning. On the other hand, sometimes we get the case of sort of overconfidence, or in some situations we have what are called false beginners, students who kind of think that they already know a little bit of the language and therefore won't necessarily need to try, don't see a lot of room for growth, and don't experience a tremendous amount of success in second language acquisition because they're convinced that they won't have to put any effort into it. Often that's actually just hiding their own insecurities as well. So that may not be actually high self-esteem, but they get a high degree of ego. It's hard to kind of parse some of that out sometimes. But I would say kind of a healthy self-understanding with still sort of mindset where you believe there's room to grow is probably the like sweet spot on this self-esteem question. But what about this idea of self-efficacy? Does anyone know what that
I do. I haven't finished.
Okay.
Basically, I closed it. The ability to produce or a desire or intended results. So self-efficacy basically is your ability to like create that desire or effect.
Right, and it's sort of also related to the idea of who do you believe is responsible for your success or failure.
The teacher.
Right.
No, I'm just kidding.
It's students can have a variety of perceptions or range of perceptions on who they believe is responsible for their success in learning and even specifically language learning. So what might be some of the upsides or downsides to a student who believes that they are very responsible or that somebody else is very responsible for whether or not they're successful?
It gets down to the fact of like, my joking around the teacher, I'm blaming it all on you. The fact that I'm not learning, the fact that I'm not producing the result that I want to produce, it's all your fault.
So not taking any
No,
responsibility.
I'm not taking any responsibility. So you believe it. And then it's the other way around too. where if the teacher is doing a poor job, but the teacher can say that it's the students.
Mhm.
So it's like two-way, it's like a coin.
I think that
You
was,
understand? Two ways.
Angel, what were you gonna say?
I was just gonna ask, like, that last part, like, yeah, like, sometimes, like, you gotta have, like, also, like, a healthy, like, balance of something. And it's like, you also, like, don't wanna, like, put all the blame on yourself. Like, the program, you're, like, taking it like that, and you, like, put all the blame on yourself, and not realize that, like, you're protecting the girl, or girl, maybe, like, you're, like, change, like, teacher, or something.
Right, so I think that's a great point as well, that it's not just sort of teacher or student, but there could be like, even the whole approach to language learning could be one that's not especially effective, and the student experiences a lot of discouragement and self-blame, just saying like, well, I'm a dumb. I've been studying this language for years, and so just not able to use it at all, when there could be these external factors that the student isn't even aware of, that are somewhat responsible for whether or not this.
Just to clarify, you're a good teacher.
Oh, thanks. Don't have to reassure me. I trust you and let me know if you're struck.
Oh, I also let you know.
What about this idea of inhibition? What are inhibitions and how do they maybe impact second language acquisition? What's inhibition?
I don't know what it means.
It's, yeah,
Something that, like, it gets, like,
something that gets in the way. Yeah, okay. And if we're thinking of affective or emotional, behavioral, these kinds of considerations, what might inhibition be?
Subconscious.
Being self-conscious, something that's keeping you from doing something you might otherwise want to. So people will often talk about when they drink a lot of alcohol or smoke weed or do these kinds of things, they interact differently in social situations because their inhibitions are gone, right? Using those substances makes you willing to do things you might not otherwise do socially or driving or doing a number of activities. But if you're sober, you would not, it lowers your inhibition. Now, I'm not suggesting that if we all just were under the influence, we would lower that affective filter and become very successful. But just that idea, what's an inhibition? It's something that is keeping us from acting on impulses that may or may not be good for us, but they would typically have certain social inhibitions, things that we're not willing to do or we are hesitant to do. So how do you think, sort of what inhibitions would you expect adults to bring to the language classroom? And what about younger kids or adolescents? What kind of inhibitions do you think might be at play for those different ages of learning?
So for kids, I don't think they have a lot of information since they're not at that stage of like their, for example, not adolescent peer pressure. Peer
Okay,
pressure is one of the biggest inhibitions.
okay,
Like, oh, you don't sound cool, so whatever. As an adult, self-consciousness. That's like, am I saying it right? I don't want to mess up how I'm saying it, stuff like that. So those are my tricks.
okay, great. Others? What kind of inhibitions do you think?
I guess for adults, since we go through a lot, probably like how we mentioned earlier, the anxiety, stress. But looking at it from the kids' perspective, I guess they don't have the anxiety and the stress, but they do have like the shyness, like the shy from talking, and like how Mandy said, like, are they saying it correct or not? But it is possible for them to learn it fast, like learn the language faster than us, since we have like a lot of things that block in our minds.
Yeah, I think that both of those you bring good points. Anything you consider to that?
I would say, like, time, something, like, adults, like, we got, like, we got, like, a lot of, like, responsibility going on, like going to work, like taking care of like kids and stuff like that. You know, younger kids that don't really have that inhibition. And I think adolescents, like it just comes to like self-esteem, or fun and adolescents, like kids can say, like that.
Yeah, I think those are all good points. But in general, small kids don't have a lot of inhibitions. Some children are more shy than others, yeah. But in general, they're not usually worried about um, saying things wrong, about being perceived to be strange when trying to use another language. Once you get to adolescence, you become much more aware, hyper aware even of how others perceive you and not wanting social approval, not wanting to stand out, right? And then as adults, we tend to have a much kind of, yeah, go ahead, Bishar.
Just think about like something on my practice. I forgot and she was still learning. She was talking about they were going to be there, but we know she was planning to go back to school. It took her like, it's sixth grade to 6th, 7th grade. And even when you're like shy, I mean, when you shy, the attention can still flow. The attention still be on because you're quiet, you're more quiet.
That's actually like maybe drawing more attention. And I think honestly, it depends a lot on that situation. So if you're the one English language learner, one of very few, suddenly in a situation where everyone else is mostly, proficient in English, then that affective filter, then those inhibitions can be much higher than when you're in a situation where there's a lot more English language learners, where it feels more normalized and more safe. But there's a lot of us who are still learning and we're trying, and it's kind of just a normalized part of your classroom culture. Sometimes we talk in second language acquisition about the idea of a language ego. And this is the idea that sort of your identity is wrapped around the language that you speak. And so when you start to develop another language, or you get the ability to use an L2, sometimes you develop an L2 ego, sort of an alternate identity that is useful to sort of separate yourself from the person who's learning the language in a sense. So we find that sometimes, for example, students who come as exchange students in our intensive English program here at Northeastern will frequently choose an English name that they want to be called for the semester or year that they're here. Sometimes that's because they think their name is challenging for English users to pronounce, but sometimes too, they're trying out a different persona in English. And there's a sort of distance which can be created then for that person sort of psychologically to say, I can take risks and I can be uninhibited in this second language as Kelly, because Kelly isn't me, really. Kelly is trying these things out and she can make mistakes and people can kind of laugh and engage. And it's safe for Kelly to be able to do that in a way that it's not safe for my actual first name and my L1 go to do that. Have you heard of this phenomenon before, this idea of developing L2? So some of you are nodding your head. What do you think of that idea? Yeah, yeah, tell me more.
Well, when I realized that what you said was over to the nail shop, and I really I realized that they got a different name, so they put on like a new name for the city.
Yeah. Other thoughts on this idea of L2 ego? Yeah, go ahead. Tom.
I was just thinking, shouldn't there be, where it be,
What?
I would almost picture somebody, developing a personality.
Okay. Uh-huh.
You know, see that like, oh, today I'm Kelly, so I'm gonna be doing things the American way. Going against what family and their culture, because they're not them, they're somebody else.
Uh-huh.
That, my mind went there.
Okay.
That doesn't sound very healthy.
My mind went there too.
I think that there can be some helpfulness to this L2 identity, more in terms of thinking about inhibition, more in terms of thinking about sometimes a person who is especially inhibited in taking risks in their second language can really benefit from the distance. But I think you raise a good point that at a certain point, there can be so much, like such a lack of integration between their L1 ego or L1 identity and what they're developing for second language identity. That as they progress in their use of the second language, are they then kind of unable to reintegrate these cells? And that they become kind of this other person in one language than they were in their first language. I mean, I think that it kind of, I think especially for people who, for example, immigrate to another culture, fully trying to assimilate with this L2 ego, there can be a lot of sort of loss of their connection to their first language and first culture, their connection to their family and their heritage, these kinds of things. It can become very complex. But at the same time, kind of as like a classroom strategy, there can be some use to this idea of sort of showing up in the classroom as this alter ego and being willing to try things and take risks and be silly in language use in a way that you wouldn't be doing. We'll look at this a little bit when we look at the method called desuggestipedia that will be coming up in a few weeks in this class that makes use of these L2 identities or L2 egos that maybe somewhat happen. So there's actually a phrase in second language acquisition called willingness to communicate, WTC. And it means the intention to initiate communication given the choice. So a person's willingness to communicate is basically how willing they are to initiate communication, to actually use a language to communicate. If they have a choice about whether or not to do so. Do you think that a student who's very willing to communicate makes a better language learner than those who have lower levels of willingness to communicate? Oh, verbally? It could be, you know, typically thought in terms of listening and speaking, but it could also be in reading.
No,
Why not?
because as an example earlier, if you someone quiet, speak completely, the language completely perfect. You can be someone who talks a lot and I know the language. I'm serious. Like the willing to communicate, communication is precisely something important that plays a role in learning the language. Because in the end, we're all learning the language for our own purposes. So, for example, originally, for me, learning Italian was out of curiosity. Did I learn Italian? Yes. Some of the students who were in there just wanted to participate in the class. So did they learn Italian? Yes. They were like after a couple of few students who just had a week of class in the language. And they had fun with it too. They were excluded to silence. So not this.
So not necessarily. Some students, they're not necessarily. They'll just sort of talk.
Like me.
In a way that, yeah, in a way that's not especially helpful. Does anyone think? Yeah.
I think if they communicate, it will.
Okay.
So as an example of my mom, she knows a bit English, but she does not communicate. She's too shy to talk. Okay, let me say this one, let me say this one. So and then she's like, I don't know English, I don't know English. Then me and my sister go to okay, then let's talk in English at home. So when you communicate with us, you will learn. And she just don't want to do it.
So, I mean, I think you raised a really good point there, Valentina, that is your mom able to read English, write English at all? She is. Okay, so that says to me, the amount of English that she's studied has been effective, but her affective filter is quite high, right? She has inhibitions. She feels very nervous about pronouncing things wrong, not being able to say things right. And so her willingness to communicate is pretty low, and you don't see progress then, right? She's sort of at a plateau where she's not going to keep improving if she's not willing to get more.
I was just thinking, it's kind of my mom's in the same boat. But my mom's case is her anxiety. She just has a very high level of anxiety. Forward.
Yeah.
So it's not that the willingness is just her brain just it just freezes her. You know, her anxiety just shuts down.
Yeah.
So I don't know how that could really be accurate to describe your willingness to. I don't know, more like your ability, maybe more than your willingness, because she wants to. She just.
I think this willingness to communicate and then issues related to anxiety are both parts of that affective filter, but they're not the same thing necessarily, right? So she has your mom has a willingness to communicate,
Yeah.
but her anxiety is so high that filter has been really, really narrow. I don't know if your mom experiences anxiety, but her willingness to communicate is so low that even if there's all this comprehensible input, she's just kind of closed off to the possibility. But then there's also those students, like Mandy mentioned, who are very willing to communicate and just talk without a lot of willingness to maybe do the listening part of communication that would help them to actually move on to sort of greater accuracy in their use of language. And we kind of talked about this, a high level of willingness to communicate manifests positively as students who have are willing to sort of put themselves out there, engage in communicative activities, even when they're, not perfectly, even when they're not using the language super accurately, they're willing to try, they're testing out hypotheses, seeing what happens. But students who, I think the example of your mom's a very good one, Valentina. She's not going to progress in her ability to do listening and speaking if she's just not ever willing to engage with those activities, right? And it's not to me even with you and your sisters, right? So it's not even like outside people that she would be worried about their reaction. But maybe, do you think there's a sense in which she's like, my girls are already so good at English, they're going to think I'm just their silly mom or something like.
No, and she even tells me, you're gonna be a teacher and you teach kids and you're not gonna teach me. Like, I'm trying to teach you. You just don't want to do it.
So,
She's like, you're okay with teaching the kids but not teaching. Like, I am trying to teach.
It reminds me of when my mom and dad took the institution when we were becoming citizens, and my brother was teaching them, and they weren't paying attention, so he would whack them. So my mom and dad, they passed the Constitution, which is my brother.
Yeah, really. The questions were high.
He was like, they were like, if you wouldn't have whacked us, if you wouldn't pay attention to it, you wouldn't have never passed it.
Closely related to all of these issues of inhibition and willingness to communicate is also this idea of risk taking. What do you think in terms of like what do I mean when I say risk taking in language learning? What is the risk? What do I mean when I say a person is be willing to take some risk?
Oh, even if you think you're gonna say it wrong, just do it.
Yeah, just being willing to say something that you think is right, but you're not sure, but you can see how it goes. What else? What else is risk taking? Crown there, what do you mean? Yeah, and like when you, so you mentioned that you've been trying to use some Spanish with some of your coworkers. What does trial and error look like in those?
Like the pronunciation might not be accurately clear, but they understand it. They understand.
Yeah. What else do I get you to write risk? Yeah.
Like, it's like asking questions.
Ah.
I think like a lot of people are scared of like, the first thing they ask means something dumb. And like, they can ask them, so, like, there may be like a lot of people who want to say questions.
Yeah, but kind of being willing to be vulnerable to sort of admit, I have a question, I need more information, I don't know everything yet. And you're taking the risk to just ask questions. Yeah.
Wouldn't that be,
What do you mean?
wouldn't that be your ego as well?
Like related, so like if you're willing or unwilling to ask a question or take a risk, often that's related to your sense of yourself, right? Letting people know that you're not perfect, not totally capable, not totally proficient, that can be very vulnerable, right?
You're not being afraid to use it.
Okay.
For example, as we go to spicy,
Huh?
the teacher was trying, he's like, can you say, where is the spicy in Japanese? So I said it, spicy loco de sky. And he was like, no, you said it in English. You need to say it in Japanese. I'm like, what does that mean? He goes like, spicy. You need to say it in Japanese. And I'm like, oh, you're right. So then it's spicy loco de sky. And then he's like, correct, very good. And then I was really happy.
And were you nervous?
No,
Were you nervous? No.
I'm old. Like, that's the best. That's my excuse from now on. Like, I'm old. I've been there. Like, I'm not scared anymore. I'm the risk taker. I do it. I'm not scared. If I'm wrong, the teacher will be kind enough to help me, to guide me the right way. And that's what I've been finding out. Once I came back to college, when I was 28, I came back to college. And throughout this whole journey, just found out that like the younger students are afraid, but I don't care.
You know, I feel like the example that I can think of from my own life is I studied Spanish when I was in middle school and high school, and I had years of studying Spanish. And like I was very good at reading and writing Spanish, and I wanted to become better at listening and speaking Spanish. But I am a person who is just really perfectionist. Honestly, I hold myself to high standards that I don't like. And that is a real problem in becoming a communicative user of another language. And I also just hadn't developed enough real relationships with L1 Spanish speakers. When I moved to Rogers Park, probably almost 20 years ago, my neighbors right next door were a Mexican family, so delightful, so warm, so friendly. Were super, super kind to us. Mom and dad spoke very little English. The kids were, pretty bilingual, although some of them are quite small, so they still use Spanish primarily. But they would, piece together as many English words as they could to talk to us, to offer us food. When I had my son, they brought us gifts. Like, we're so, so generous. And it was months before I would even let on that I knew any Spanish. I would let them keep taking the risk and keep trying with the little bit of English they had until finally I was like, you are such a ridiculous jerk. Because families like theirs have to take the risk every day. They have to be the ones making the mistake. They have to be the ones looking silly. And here I am with my 7 years of studying Spanish, and I won't even try. And I said, this is absurd. And I just started trying. And they were like, what? They were like, what have you been doing all this time? And I found that I was starting to grow in my confidence the the more that we would chat together. And it just was a really important experience for me on a few levels. One, recognizing that taking the risk was the only way to put yourself out there, to see what worked, to make the mistakes, to share the laugh about it, and then to move on and get better. And also, for me, honestly, as a white American English speaker, to recognize that is just this L1 English American privilege that I will just keep expecting other people to try with English, and I won't take this risk and try and use my second language that I've had all this privilege to study. So to me, that, on a couple of levels, that was important to recognize both the language learning value of taking the risk and also those power dynamics that I think we really don't necessarily recognize as speaking as a white American. So someone else is doing it.
I was just thinking, I wouldn't have thanked you as for not being a risk taker, only because of your, going back to your husband's $50 to yours. Wouldn't you be more of a risk taker because you're just kind of.
I'm willing to just like sort of see how it turns out. Yeah. I don't know, like, why is it different with language? I think that's kind of your question, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, I would be more scared of feeding somebody something that, it's like. Person is saying
something wrong.
the correct version of the word.
Honestly, I don't know that I can fully explain why my thought process.
It's your confidence level. You're more confident on your cooking than you are on your language.
Maybe that I feel like I've kind of always, I've like learned to cook from a young age, so
Yeah.
I've kind of done it for a long time, so I have a lot of like sense of like, well, I know this isn't gonna go terribly, and like, it may not turn out exactly how I was expecting, but I know what to expect. And I feel like in an interpersonal exchange with someone, and I'm not sure if they're gonna understand me, and then I'm gonna inadvertently say something insulting. Are we both gonna feel like we're gonna be awkward? Like, is it gonna be this really unpleasant or uncomfortable situation? I don't have the confidence often to do that. Now, that was 20 years ago. I would say that at this point in my life, I'm probably not really that much better at Spanish, but I'm despite, right, like still trying, because since that point, like I got super involved in as the years went on, I had kids, I was super involved in their primary school, got super involved with a lot of the moms volunteering, built a lot of really substantial friendships with folks who had very little English. So I was constantly like, all right, I will just have to try and you'll try and we'll meet in the middle. And it's not like, I don't think my Spanish is actually that much better, but I'm much more willing to communicate. I'm much more willing to say, like, it doesn't have to be perfect, and that's not actually the point. The relationships are the more important piece, and the language facilitates that. So, it's a little.
You explained it perfectly fine.
How can we take advantage of the risk takers in our class? You're always going to find that there's students who are willing to take the risk. How can we utilize those kids and adults too?
Speaking of that, for example, I personally know, and I tell the teacher something. If you need someone to answer, even if I don't know the answer, pick on me, because I'm not afraid to say, I don't know. So what was that?
Yeah, in the online program of the intensive English program here, the Sail Anywhere program, we have classes that are mostly dominated by students from our partner university in South Korea, but then also a handful of students in Bangladesh and Afghanistan. And the Koreans, their style of learning English is very accuracy focused and not a lot of fluency. So they are super hesitant to speak at all. They don't like to make mistakes. That is just the way that their English curriculum has been built. They hate to make a mistake, so they really don't like to take risks. For whatever reason, those South Asian students, this is just not a concern. They will just talk, whether or not, and actually they also have a pretty high degree of accuracy. But one thing we have found is those students who are willing to take risks and just put themselves out there and use their English almost give permission to those other students for whom taking the risk is much fun. They sort of almost establish a classroom culture of it being okay for everybody to take risks, make mistakes, and learn together. That can be really good modeling for a more effective. It can, go overboard. Again, the students will just talk regardless of, and almost like dominate the conversation. Then you have to kind of manage that situation as well. And those can be the kind of problems that risk takers bring, but if they can be sort of appropriately managed and drawing out those who are more less likely to take risks, then those risk takers can really bring a lot to giving everybody permission in the class. We mentioned anxiety. And I know we're running out of time, so this is a little bit I want to get through today, but when we think about anxiety, it can be a trait, which sounds like more what your mom has, right? Like it is just an enduring part of her personality. But anxiety can also be a state, or it's triggered by specific circumstances and conditions that they don't. Exactly. The state is the more situational anxiety. The trait is the more sort of enduring in all circumstances. Anxiety can be debilitative, can really keep us from doing the things that we want to do or things that help us thrive. Or a certain amount of anxiety can actually be facilitative or help us to do the things we need to do. Can you give an example? Or can you think of a time you've experienced facilitative
Well, not
anxiety?
me, but I've seen it. My daughter, she suffers from anxiety. She's been going there since she was in 6th grade. Because I saw similar behaviors from my mom and her, so I knew where I was going. Anyway, so in therapy, she cries, but she continues working on whatever it is that's causing her.
Yeah.
And she gets through it.
Yeah.
She falls apart, but she doesn't stop.
Yeah.
And that's been through her therapy that's helped her deal with, I'm gonna have this fear, I'm gonna have these things. It's okay to be upset. It's okay to feel like this. Just continue working. She gets it done.
Other examples of times you've seen anxiety actually lead to doing the thing you need to do. Angel.
I also mean with bad anxiety about everything.
Yeah.
Even come to class today, I have done some classes and the business of the things I know are wrong. So I kind of use it as a button. Kind of even talking right now, I kind of have to force myself talk versus anxiety, wrong, or understanding something enough.
Yeah.
I also force myself to talk more to ask stuff to make sure it doesn't become a problem later in the future.
Kudos to you for being so self-aware, having your strategies to work through it, right? It's something where you want to be. Even just the simple existence of deadlines, right? If something is due, that creates a little bit of anxiety sometimes to make you do the thing you need to do. This is the whole thing about procrastination. I mean, really, sometimes people procrastinate because they need the deadline. They need the thing ticking right there to let them know I have to do this thing. And that's the only thing that gets you to do it, right? Krashen talked about this idea of anxiety and the affective filter. His position is that anxiety has to be 0 in the language learning classroom. Do you think that's true, or is there anything wrong with that line of thinking?
It's not.
Okay.
How can anybody reach that 0 point? That's asking a lot of it. Impossible, I think.
So it just seems impractical. How would we ever get to the situation where we produce a 0 right?
Right.
What other people think about this idea? Mandy, any thoughts on this?
I don't think we will,
Why not?
because people I was with my assignments, I always procrastinate. I do it the last minute.
Yeah.
And so most of the assignments will be overdue. And I still try to turn it in, but no, the end result will really be
You kind of need that anxiety to sort of make it happen, but you're always going to experience it. Right? Well, should it be a goal though? If we had it in this time before, world where some probably could create zero anxiety setting for language learners. Would that be best?
No, I don't think it can happen.
Why not?
Zero anxiety is a humble group because unfortunately, anxiety, it doesn't have to do with the classroom, I think. It will lead into, right now, at medical that has seeped into, yeah, so even though I'm trying my best not to let it affect the school life, I have to balance like all this medical stuff in order for me to get to a healthier state. And it seeps into it. There's no such thing as zero. Zero.
I think that it's right that having as low amount of anxiety as possible to lower that affective filter, let in all that comprehensive input, that's ideal. But a little bit of anxiety can be facilitated. It can help us to work harder in our classes. It can help us to try things we otherwise might not. It can be motivating on a certain level to be concerned about outcomes in the future. I'm not talking about crippling anxiety. I'm not talking about just being scared all the time or second guessing yourself constantly, but a small bit of anxiety, if we could call it that, or motivation can provide motivation to do the thing we need to do. Andy.
But would you like being lazy kind of affect the level of anxiety?
Maybe. Say more what you mean about that.
I think like what because it seems like when I'm very lazy, my anxiety is very low, and then when there's a deadline, or like you can't be lazy, you have to do it, and then like yeah.
So anxiety and motivation,
Yeah.
and sort of laziness can be all in the mix, and that could be unhelpful for us. We are out of time, so I'm gonna skip over this stuff about empathy. Sorry. The cliff notes on this one is sometimes students who have a low degree of empathy toward the L2 culture, that can impact your language learning. So if you're actually not especially you don't have a lot of warm feeling or positive feeling about the L2 culture, you can sometimes have a hard time learning that country's or that culture's language. So if you're not happy to be here, if you suddenly had your life upturned and you're not feeling great about English users, you don't have a high degree of motivation to learn their language. Having a high degree of empathy or sort of positive feeling towards L2 culture can have positive impact on learning that language. So I think, yeah, we've got to stop there. I'm sorry, I'm taking too much of your time. There is a video that's on motivation, the different kinds of motivation and how they can impact second language learning. So make sure that you do that. As always, have a look at the task list for this unit and maybe even the PowerPoints on B2L, so you could just read through those last few slides. It's probably what we do today. It's not a lot. But make sure you do that video. Your journal for this week. And have a great week. Thanks, everybody. What'd you say?
Make sure.
Yeah. Sure.